the Humboldt River when all of a sudden, the passenger cars began to derail and break loose from the engines. One after another, they crashed into the riverbed below. 24 dead passengers lay buried inside the mountain of wreckage. 115 others had sustained injuries. By morning, an investigation into the cause of the crash was underway. It quickly became clear that it was sabotage. The cars had jumped the track because a saboteur had removed a number of spikes and then pulled a rail out of alignment. A search of the river uncovered tools which were believed to have been used to move the displaced rail.
There were typical tools used by railroad workers working on the track, so there was an immediate suspicion of a disgruntled worker. The investigation of this wreck took on almost a passion among the law enforcement people, the railroad people. They wanted to find who did this.
Eventually, 1,144 major leads were investigated without luck. The railroad continued its investigation well into the 1950s, but although they believed the perpetrator of the crime was one of their own employees, the person who caused the wreck of the city of San Francisco was never caught. As the middle of the 20th century approached, safety measures, such as two-way radios for communication and automatic braking systems for stopping trains when an engineer missed a warning signal, were truly reducing the hazards of train travel. Still, disasters were not entirely eliminated. On February 18, 1947, the Red Arrow, one of Pennsylvania Railroad's so-called Blue Ribbon Fleet, crashed on an Allegheny mountainside. 23 people perished. The Red Arrow was more than an hour late on its way from Detroit to New York when it was hurled off the track at Bennington Curve. The Interstate Commerce Commission found that excessive speed had caused the train to derail. Excessive speed was the cause of another, far more deadly derailment in 1951.
A shambles of twisted steel near Woodbridge, New Jersey, is the stark picture of one of the worst railroad tragedies in the nation's history. Plunging 26 feet from a temporary trestle, the engine and 8 cars of the cracked Broker Special crashed down an embankment. The train was carrying 1,000 passengers.
The Broker Special was particularly crowded the evening of the wreck because a labor strike had closed down the operations of another railroad. Of the more than 1,000 people who were on board the train, 84 were killed and 350 sustained injuries. The temporary trestle where the train derailed had a reduced speed limit of 25 miles per hour. Later testimony indicated that the engineer knew about the trestle and its reduced speed limit. Nevertheless, the investigation determined the train was traveling at over 50 miles per hour when it derailed. There is one crash that has been called the all-time sensational runaway train wreck. It occurred on January 15, 1953. Thousands of visitors were on their way to the nation's capital to attend the presidential inauguration of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Some were arriving at Washington's Union Station on board Pennsylvania Railroad's Federal Express. As the train approached the station, the engineer applied the brakes. When they did not respond, he began to blast his horn to warn the train yard that disaster was imminent. There was just enough time for passengers on board the Federal to move to the rear of the train and for people in the station to run for their lives. Shortly thereafter, the Federal plowed into the building, destroying the station master's office and the main newsstand. After the train came to a halt, the station's floor gave way and the locomotive fell into the basement. 87 people were injured in the wreck of the Federal, but amazingly, not a single person was killed.
Now, the Eisenhower inauguration was just a few days away. What do you do when you got a locomotive sitting in the basement of your station and most people are going to arrive by train for the inauguration? Well, you just build a floor over it. And a lot of people arrived for the Eisenhower inauguration and they wouldn't have been able to tell anything happened if it hadn't been for the newspaper stories.
A few weeks later, the false floor was removed. The locomotive was lifted out and reassembled. It was then put back on the tracks, and it continued to run for years. By the 1950s, the automobile had become the American way to get around. People were choosing to travel on the interstate highways, forsaking the steel tracks of the railroads. Gradually, passenger trains became fewer in number. The airline industry finished the job of wiping out most of what was left of train passenger service. As the number of people riding the rails diminished, fewer passengers were killed and injured in railroad accidents. The era when train disasters were commonplace had come to an end.